Thanks for coming. This is our last talk of the season, so it's really great to see so many of you here. You probably recognise me from being a member of the Mammal Group committee. I am talking today about my project that I've been doing with the Warwickshire Wildlife Trust on harvest mice. So I'll be talking a bit about harvest mouse ecology. You may or may not know a little bit about them. We'll start from the basics. Then I'll talk a bit about the threats that they're facing and potential ways to manage habitat and improve the habitat to make it a bit better for them. I'll also discuss ways which we can find them, surveying techniques that we use to see if they're out and about. And finally, I'll discuss my project and the results that I found and how that sort of impacts our management in Warwickshire. So, to start off with, the harvest mouse is part of the rodent order, as you may have guessed. Unlike, say, a dormouse, it doesn't hibernate and is active throughout the whole year and also over a 24-hour period. They are largely crepuscular, so dusk-dawn animals, but they can be out and about at any time, and particularly in the winter you might see them more in the day because it's a bit warmer for them than coming out at night. And this means that we can survey them in the winter, which is great. So they were first distinguished as a separate species by Wright. You may have heard of Gilbert Wright, in Hampshire, in Selborne actually, and he was the first one really to note how different they were to other mice. So in particular their tiny size, which we'll talk about in a minute, their shape, their colour, and also the fact that they make really distinctive looking nests, again which we'll discuss later. Unfortunately, there was a local extinction in the area of Selborne recently over the past couple of decades or so. So although they were first found there and recognised there, they then seemed to disappear. But there is some good news there. So 11 farmers in the area got together and decided they wanted to do something about it. So they connected up the local landscape using hedgerows and margins and grassy areas. And we've actually seen the return of the harvest mouse to Selborne. This year they found 150 nests in the last survey, I believe, which is great news, so they're back. So the harvest mouse is tiny. It's only 6 to 8 grams, it's about that big, so very, very little. And it can sometimes be mistaken as a very small vole because it tends to look more like a vole than a classic kind of Mickey Mouse. It doesn't have the very large eyes and the big ears of, say, a wood mouse, for instance. It does have relatively large eyes so that it can see, particularly in the dark. And it has a short, blunt muzzle, which is, again, more vole-like. Small, hairy ears, so it doesn't have those big mouse-like ears. Particular adaptations that a harvest mouse has to its habitat are the fact that it has a semi-prehensile tail and also large hind feet with a slightly opposed thumb. Now, both of these adaptations allow it to climb about in its vegetation where it lives, and so it climbs about in a stalk zone of grasses, again, which we'll talk about later. You can see that it's a browny, orangey colour above and a pale colour below, and it does tend to look a bit darker in the winter because it's got a dorsal stripe of guard hairs that tend to get a bit thicker in the winter. So the range of the harvest mouse is actually quite large, as you can see from this map. It is listed as a species of least concern by the IUCN, but for us it's a priority species for conservation in the UK. And this is because it's thought to have experienced a decline of up to 71% in the last 18 years. It's generally found in the south and east of England, although there are more patchy populations further north. So recently it was confirmed that there are still populations within, say, Northumberland and Durham, and obviously we do have some here as well, which I'll be talking about later. So the harvest mouse is traditionally associated with farmland, and in fact the first records are about 2 to 3 million years ago in China, and we think that it kind of spread over here when the ice sheet retreated and we started chopping down all the woodland and getting some farmland in there, which really helped it. But it doesn't just live in farmland, again, which we'll discuss later, and it doesn't just eat grain. It eats seeds and leaves predominantly, but it's very eclectic in what it eats. and will eat seeds and it will eat berries and fruits and also insects. So in captivity, it has been known that it prefers insects over all other sources of food and will actively hunt and chase live insect prey and also try and gnaw at the stems of plants that have pupae inside them. It will also eat fungi, moss, eggs, potentially parts of other rodents, anything really. It's a bit of an opportunist, which is helpful in this day and age. But it doesn't need to eat as much as, say, a shrew, which might consume its entire body weight daily, and that's largely because of the water content of its food. But it does need to keep eating about 30% of its body weight each day, and that's largely because it's got quite a large surface area to volume ratio. And unlike other animals, it doesn't actually grow a thicker coat in the winter, so it does get quite cold, so it does need to keep eating. So the habitat of the harvest mouse is actually quite eclectic. So I mentioned before that it's traditionally associated with farmland, but essentially a harvest mouse can live anywhere really that has a dense amount of vegetation, with some sturdy stems to whatever that vegetation may be. So they like grasses such as cocksfoot, reed canary, something with a bit of substance to it that can hold up their nests, again, which we'll talk about later. Bulrushes, rushes, also reeds, and it likes to support its nest amongst bramble, meadowsweet, those kind of things that will hold up their nest. So this means that we can find them in a wide range of habitats. So they might be meadows, in nature reserves, might be wetlands, reed beds, farmland, etc. So you can find them in a really wide range of areas. One thing to say is that they do change their habits seasonally, so in the winter they'll be more ground dwelling, and this is largely because it's warmer down on the ground, and also they're potentially a bit less visible to predators from above. And in the summer they tend to move throughout the stalk zone of grasses. Their breeding season is mainly from May to October, although in mild years they can breed up until December. So that's something to think about given the recent winter that we had here. They may have been breeding a lot later. It varies how many litters they might have per year, especially depending on whether they're in the wild or in captivity. Essentially the female will have several litters, normally of about 4 or 5 young at a time, with a gestation period of 17 to 19 days. And there's usually no paternal care. The mother will often drive the father off after mating. So the female will build a new nest for every litter that she has, and this is what we call a breeding nest. So these are the nests that you may have already heard about or associated with harvest mice. They tend to be quite large, so about 6 to 8 centimetres in diameter. They're often located off the ground, between the stalks of different grasses, and they'll be woven. They'll be made of leaves that are shredded longitudinally using the teeth, and they will be woven together to make a sphere, a ball-shaped nest, and they're usually quite distinctive. They tend to not have an entrance hole when they're being occupied. The mother will try and put it together so that you can't see a hole. But once they've been occupied for a little while, or indeed when they're no longer being used, you can see an entrance hole. You can get other nests that harvest mice use that aren't to do with their breeding. So they're normally non-breeding temporary shelters that can be used by both of the sexes. And they're a lot less intricately woven, a lot less stable in structure, and a lot smaller, normally about 4 centimetres. Sometimes the mother will make a little kind of temporary nest nearby to her breeding nest in case she gets disturbed, and then she'll move the young over there and try not to disturb them too much, particularly in the peak breeding season in case this does occur. So if this works, it should be a video of the mum making a nest. So you can see that she's shredding the leaves lengthways. And those leaves are often still attached to the stems so that the sphere is held in place in situ. And you can see she's using her tail to grab hold of the stems. usually build their nests at night. This is obviously in the day, but usually it's at night time. They can take several days, up to a week even, to build. Yeah, it is pretty cute, isn't it? Okay, so when the young do arrive, they're pretty defenceless, really. They don't have any fur yet, they're born blind, and they're under a gram in weight usually, so they're really, really tiny. But they grow rapidly, and by the time they're almost a fortnight old, they are starting to explore outside the nest. They're generally getting the hang of climbing. And by the time they're 16 days old, they'll generally be driven from the nest by the mother. They might hang out together as juveniles for a couple of days, but then they'll disperse. The juveniles do look slightly different. They're generally a bit darker, and they do molt after about a month. So you can see here the bottom end is starting to molt, and it's becoming a bit more orangey into its adult pelage. And by about 1.5 months old, they are actually able to breed. So it's quite a quick process. And it's really actually quite hard to tell how old a harvest mouse is just by looking at its fur. The only really reliable method is to look at the wear on teeth. You can't really do that if you're looking at a live harvest mouse. Trust me on that one, it's quite difficult. Okay, so they generally live for about 6 months in the wild, although in captivity they have been known to live up to 5 years, so there's the potential there. They generally are thought to survive the longest if they're born in October, and they can then overwinter. But a lot depends on the conditions of when they're born. So weather is a main cause of mortality in harvest mice. So if you get lots of hard frosts or sudden drops in temperature, it can really, really get to them, and there are big drops in numbers when this happens. And one thing to note is particularly rain and flooding, so something that we've had a lot of this winter. Generally, the nests that they build are quite water resistant, but if you get a really wet autumn and the nest becomes saturated, then the juveniles will die. So flooding and a lot of rain are quite a big risk, mainly to the juveniles. The other main cause of mortality are predators. So being quite small, they are a main food source for a lot of things. And this is only increased by the fact that they can be active 24 hours a day. So they get predated upon by a whole range of animals. So in particular, we think of owls and birds of prey that swoop down from above. There are also loads of other things like foxes, weasels, like in this amazing picture that someone recently took, toads, snakes, herons, all sorts really. So unfortunately, they're kind of lower in the food chain in that aspect. Okay, other threats than being eaten immediately mainly come from us really. So practice of burning land, mainly in mainland Europe at the moment. They don't seem to kind of escape and run like rats do, so they might not actually go anywhere, they might just burn. Potentially farming practices, the changes that we've made have actually impacted them quite a lot. So at first people thought the combine harvesters were a main cause of mortality, literally with the mice just getting caught up in them. But it's actually probably unlikely that this is the case, because the adults can escape and run off, jump to the ground and run. But it could be a cause of mortality in the juveniles if it's being cut at the main time of year when the juveniles are around, if they're still in the nest and the nest gets caught up. But it's more probably to do with the fact that the way that we farm now, we don't have as many winter crops to provide shelter and food at this time of year. Also the fact that there has been an increase in the use of pesticides, not just in farming, in general land, in our gardens as well. And that means that there's probably less insect prey for them to eat. And also the way that we're planting our crops means that they're very regular, and there's often quite a bit of gapping in between the stems, whereas before you get dense clumps, which are good for harvest mice because they can reach them. If you think about how small they are, it takes quite a lot of effort to be able to reach and climb between the stems. Other things to consider are, of course, habitat loss that's impacting most of our wildlife, and climate change, and of course flooding, as I mentioned earlier. So, there are ways in which we can easily help harvest mice, that's the good news. So there are lots of things out to get them. It's thought that they're in decline, but we can do something about it, and it doesn't always have to take that much effort. In fact, sometimes it's the opposite of effort, because we can just leave areas to go a bit wild. So if we leave areas of uncut grass, cut on a minimum sort of 3 to 5 year rotation, leave grassy field margins if at all possible on farmland. Also, the planting of wild bird crops, especially with varieties of millet in there, provides a good food source and a place for them to nest. Leaving tall vegetation, particularly around wet areas, which they really like, is good. And the key thing that's coming out of a lot of studies recently is the fact that the habitat needs to be connected. And this is something that we're seeing obviously with a lot of our wildlife. So we need to keep those corridors, and one of the main ways that we can do this is by planting hedgerows and maintaining those hedgerows, but also making sure that they have sort of adjacent grassy margins by the side of them, and that's really key for harvest mice. It's difficult to recommend a time to cut grassland. Some people say that for harvest mice it's quite bad to cut it in the autumn when you've got a lot of juveniles about, and they're likely to die from that. But they're also quite abundant at this time of year, so it's less likely to impact their numbers. Whereas some people say if you cut in the winter it's a bad idea because their numbers are really low already, so you're going to impact those populations massively. So probably the best idea is to make sure that you cut on a rotation and there's always some kind of safety habitat that they can reach that's connected. There have been other initiatives that are sometimes quite novel that people have used to help harvest mice populations. So as well as sort of introduction and reintroduction programmes, there was this great idea to use tennis balls to sort of increase the number of nests and boost populations that way. Unfortunately, although it sounded great, it didn't necessarily work, and that's because of two main reasons really. One, the fact that the cattle, if there were any in the vicinity, seemed to like the tennis balls and ate them. And the other, the fact that as a breeding nest, they're not that useful because they don't stretch. If you think that you've got 4 or 5 youngsters in there with the mum, getting bigger every day for 2 weeks wasn't really viable. Potentially as a non-breeding nest, but unfortunately the idea was ditched slightly. But it did seem like fun, it was worth a try, I think. Okay, so how do we know if these harvest mice are about? How do we survey for them? How do we find out where they are? The most reliable method, and probably the quickest, is to look for nests. So their nests are so distinctive, they're not often confused with those of other species. And it's a great way to see if you've had harvest mouse in the area. And if you've got someone with you who recognises the nest and has got the eye for it basically, it can take 5 minutes just to find one if you're in suitable habitat. The methods generally involve doing a transect or some sort of grid pattern across the habitat, noting how many people are searching, how much effort, for how long, the kind of vegetation, etc, etc. But the idea is generally just to part the vegetation carefully down to the bottom and see if you can find any nests, and just to keep doing that. Sometimes though this can be problematic because although they are quite distinctive, by the time that you get to the end of the survey season they're generally a bit battered. If you think that they're starting to make them sort of May, June time, by the time we get to say February the following year, if you've had bad weather like we had this year, they can really disintegrate, and they can be slightly confused with other species. So for instance, these two at the top are birds' nests, but some people might think that they're another type of nest initially, and the lower ones are actually disintegrated harvest mouse nests from later in the season. And when they are disintegrated, they're actually much more easily confused with voles' nests. So voles' nests tend to be kind of short, fatter shreds that don't have much of a structure and tend to be lower on the ground. If you've got a harvest mouse nest that's taken a bit of a battering and fallen lower down, then it can look like a vole's nest, so you have to be careful by the time you're getting to the end of the survey season. Okay, so the second main method that we use to see if harvest mice are about is longworth trapping. So some of you may have done some longworth trapping before. It's a humane method of small mammal trapping. So the mammals that are caught in there have a little feed and a little sleep, and then they're released afterwards. And essentially you can bait it with a range of things, but what I've tended to use are porridge oats, chicken feed, and mealworms that were live and then frozen, so they're still containing moisture, which is important for shrews. Also some algae bedding, quite a lot of it in the winter in particular, to make sure that it's insulated, because they are just made of metal and you want your mammals to be nice and warm. So this can be done for a period of days, and you can basically lay the traps out in a transect, however many you like, or fits the habitat, and see what you find. If the traps are triggered, and you can empty them into a large bag like we have on the pictures here, and find out what you've got. And the case on the right is a little harvest mouse that I'm having a look at there. This was a collage that someone put together, which is really nice from when we were out and about doing a surveying, and it sort of shows you what it's like when you're actually doing that surveying, so looking for the nests, setting the traps. Normally in the winter we set the traps on the ground because the harvest mice are on the ground where it's warmer, but if it's particularly wet we'll put them on canes, and also in the summer a lot of people put them in canes when the harvest mouse are moving through the stalk zone. I haven't really found that much difference between traps with canes and traps without myself, but some people do say that there is. So yeah, you can see that we empty them into a big bag, and then we have a look at them and weigh them actually in a smaller bag there. So long-wave trapping is great because you can actually see the live mouse. You can take other measurements like how big it is, what sex it is, how much it weighs. It's great for community engagement because people get a chance to actually see the mice. But it's not necessarily as reliable as nest searching. You don't always trap them. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, they will elude you, even though you know that they're there. So it's just a different type of surveying. It's great if you can do both, but nest searching if you can only do one. So the final method is owl pellet analysis. So we were actually really lucky in this project that the Star Valley Wildlife Action Group donated over 300 pellets to us that they'd collected across the south of the county. And we were able to sort of run a citizen science programme where we trained people in owl pellet analysis, and then they sent in their records, which was great. So owls tend to regurgitate things that they can't digest, and they're often hard things like bones, along with things like fur, wound cases and beetles, that kind of thing. And if you actually take the pellets after you've collected them, pull them apart, and have a look what's inside, it can be really fruitful. You can find out what they've been eating, and this can tell you the location of different species if you know where you've collected the pellets from. You can also find out when they've been hunting, dependent on the habits of the mammal, whether it's out and about during the day or at night. And you can have a look at the kind of quantity of the different prey species that are in the pellets. So when you get a pellet, you generally tend to divide the remains into mice or rats, voles and shrews. You may get other things like birds or bats or moles, but these are a bit more unusual. And if you find what looks to be a mouse jaw, generally you will remove the teeth to have a look at the number of roots in the underlying jaws. This is just for interest really. But if you remove the teeth from the lower jaw of what looks to be a mouse, if it's got 7 root holes, likely to be a harvest mouse, 6 a wood mouse and 5 a house mouse, and that's one of the main ways that you can tell the difference. There are lots of other ways, and you can look at other bones other than the jaw bones. I won't go into too much detail here. So those are the 3 main methods that we've tended to use to see where our harvest mice are, to look at their distribution. But it's not without problems. The harvest mouse is tiny, it is elusive, and it is potentially easily confused to members of the public. Also, if you're looking at population data rather than presence and absence, you come up with a whole host of problems. So, like many other small mammals, harvest mice do have major population fluctuations from year to year, and it's thought that it tends to run in sort of 3-year cycles. So really, if you want population stats, you need to do a longer term study for it to be accurate. Also, if you are long-life trapping, live trapping, or doing our pellet analysis in the summertime, you're probably going to get minimal harvest mouse results, and this is because populations are generally quite low, it's thought. So that's something to consider, especially when only about 1% of a barn owl diet in general can be made up of harvest mouse remains. You're already looking for a slim chance in that respect. Also, when you're doing our pellet analysis, the remains of a harvest mouse, for those of you that have done our pellet stuff, are really quite tiny. So they can get crushed, they're quite delicate, and they could be confused with other mouse species if you can't quite see the roots. And nest searching, if you want to be comparing different areas from year to year, you need to make sure that you're looking at the same area with the same number of people searching in order to make a valid comparison, which often is not possible, particularly when you're doing sort of volunteer work and extra stuff. So there are problems, but you can still get an overview of whether you've got harvest mice and other small mammals in your area. There are lots of other things that are being tested at the moment to see if we can come up with some other methods. One of them is setting up bait traps and essentially collecting the feces of the small mammals and then DNA testing them. This may become more popular in the future, but at the moment we don't really have the resources so much to be doing that all the time. Also, there's some work being done at the moment of when feces have been collected or tubes used for a dog to sniff them and discriminate between different mice or different small mammals. So that's in a pipeline at the moment, but again may not be readily available to most organisations or people wanting to go out and survey. Another point to make is that with longworth trapping you do need a licence from Natural England, so that's something to consider as well if you wanted to go and do your own surveys. So, my project that I've been working on. So, the project that I've been working on for the last 6 months has actually been funded by the People's Trust for Endangered Species, but I've been working here with the Warwickshire Wildlife Trust to do that. And essentially, the questions that I was trying to ask are really simple. Where are harvest mice in Warwickshire and what habitats are they using? Baseline data, that's what we want. And I got trained up in the methods of surveying that I just mentioned by Dr. Roger Trout in October. So I don't know if anyone was here for the Mammal Day launch event, but Roger spoke then, for those of you that you remember him. And yeah, he trained me in all things harvest mice. He is the harvest mouse man. He knows everything about harvest mice. So I had some very sunny, enjoyable days in Surrey, as you can see here, learning everything mouse. So, pre the study that we've just done for the last 6 months, we only had 12 records of harvest mice in the county in 10 locations for the last decade. So obviously that's not very much. So we weren't sure what was going on, whether we actually don't have many harvest mice in the county, as could be suggested by the massive decline statistics that we see, or whether people just haven't been looking for them or they haven't recorded them. So what we decided to do was get that baseline data, presence, absence, find out where they are in the county. So I used the 3 surveying techniques that I discussed. Our pellet analysis we used with citizen science approach, combined with longworth trapping and nest searching at a series of sites across the county. So I went out and did that the autumn winter that's just passed with a team of dedicated volunteers. Came out with me even when it was really pouring down with rain. As we know, it was a seriously wet winter, and we basically tried to find mice. I'm pleased to say that we managed to survey 16 sites, which was great. And we now have 180 records for harvest mice across the county on top of the previous 12. So this, our records are the ones in purple, added to the ones that were in orange originally. So the 180 records consists of 133 nests that we found and 46 live harvest mice that we trapped. And also 1 additional owl pellet analysis record. We did get one. It took time. So you can see here, this is a map of all the sites that we surveyed and the different methods that we used to find the harvest mice. So we found evidence of harvest mice at every single site, all 16. We did live trap harvest mice at 9 sites, but we found nests at all of them. So you can see we generally tend to get more results from their searching. And this is a map showing the tetrads of the county that are now covered from that data. So we tried to get an even spread if we could. So you can see they are present even in the top north of the county as well, despite the distribution usually being associated with southern England and southeast England. We did manage to cover actually 21 1 kilometre squares and 19 tetrads within Warwickshire with those records. So whilst we were surveying for harvest mice, we obviously caught some other small mammals, which was quite exciting. And we have actually boosted records. We've been able to send those off to the record centre. So we found 125 other small mammals whilst we were trapping. So we found things like common shrew, pygmy shrew. We actually found a water shrew, which was highly exciting. Voles such as this bank vole, wood mice, house mice, and a rat. That was my remote camera. I happened to accidentally place it by a rat run, so there were many videos of rats that night. So that's been really great, being able to boost other small mammal records as well. And it's important to note that they're all intertwined. A harvest mouse is a small mammal, and generally where you've got harvest mice you tend to find a higher diversity in other small mammal species as well. And what can benefit a harvest mouse can normally benefit another small mammal. So although obviously I am a harvest mouse officer and love harvest mice, it's not just about particularly one species, it's about conserving a habitat for a variety of species to live in. And also recording all the small mammals is important because they also represent a food source for predators, as well as potentially competition for the harvest mouse as well, if they are eating the same food. So the habitats that harvest mice were using. So it was a surprising finding to get harvest mice at all of our sites. We didn't really expect that, to be honest. I went out and surveyed sites that I thought had potentially suitable habitat. So it wasn't just a random set of sites. I went out to see if they'd got the kind of vegetation that a harvest mouse might live in, and also ones that were connected to the rest of the habitat surrounding it. We did find harvest mice obviously across all the sites, and these included multiple habitat types, covering sort of drier grassland areas to wetland and marsh areas to the highest prevalence, which we found to be in farmland. And this is actually contrary to findings elsewhere in the country that have suggested that actually harvest mice aren't found that much in farmland anymore. But I guess an important point to make is that I was looking at farms that were well connected, and also I was deliberately surveying nice field margins, not necessarily the fields themselves, so that might be a consideration to point out there. So this is an example habitat map of where we found harvest mice. This is actually Brandon Marsh here. So I was able to use the habitat biodiversity audit data from the Warwickshire Wildlife Trust, which is essentially habitat maps that have been done already, and I was able to overlay my data onto those, which is great, so we can get an idea of what's going on, as well as the data that I collected myself in the field. So you should hopefully be able to see a tiny red dot, which represents a mouse, alongside some purple circles, which represent nests, and they're amongst a very blue area, which essentially is marshland. So that is Brandon Marsh, where we have found some harvest mice. And this is just in contrast to a very different kind of habitat. This is a much more urban site, and the kind of lighter yellow is represents amenity areas amongst improved grassland, and the orangey bit there. So they're two very contrasting sites, showing that habitats do vary greatly, but you can still find harvest mice in that wide range. And again, the important point to note is you can see the connectivity in those habitats. You can see that there's a woodland and river corridor running through here, the green and blue for instance. So that really does seem to be key. So we wanted to put harvest mice on the map, which hopefully we well and truly did. But we also wanted to make sure that we got the communities involved and that we raised awareness really about harvest mice, because you don't really hear about them that much considering they're thought to have experienced over 70% decline. So it still involved training up some dedicated volunteers in all things harvest mice really. And this was great for me because I got loads of help when I was out on sites, which was fantastic. But it also meant that hopefully these volunteers now have new skills which they can continue to use, which is fab. Yeah, some of you are obviously here, so sorry for the pictures, it's embarrassing. And this continued throughout, so there's a lot of community engagement. So we got different groups involved in surveying. A lot of them approached us and were really interested, which was great. Also did quite a few workshops in colleges as well, so this is one of our owl pellet workshops. Mammal Group Day that we did with Staffordshire and Warwickshire Mammal Groups, some of you may have been there. We looked for nests, we did do a bit of trapping but sadly didn't find anything. It was very cold, I seem to remember. And also local organisations them involved, so council parks and staff and volunteers there. Yeah, again, some of you here, so apologies for the photos. And of course raising awareness through the written word and social media and the internet. So we put out a call for sightings initially at the beginning of the project to get people in contact. Also with organisations who've done Twitter posts, Facebook posts, articles in magazines. We wrote an article with Coombe Country Park for DEFRA's publication, Biodiversity News, and this weekend I'll be at the Mammal Society annual conference presenting the work that we've done on this project. So really just getting it out there, talking to people about harvest mice, putting them on the radar of people in conservation and elsewhere. So something to end with really is some food for thought. So we're often kind of bombarded with really negative information about the state of our wildlife, which is often very true and sad, but it doesn't always have to be that way. So for harvest mice we've actually got quite a positive picture coming through, which is such a change and such a difference. It's just great to hear that there is actually hope for harvest mice. So just in my little project, which was just looking at presence and absence, so that is something to bear in mind. We didn't look at populations, but we can see that they are actually more widespread and using a diverse range of habitats, more so than we might have anticipated. And this is the story that we're finding in different projects across the country. So perhaps with impending climate change and habitat loss, the harvest mice might actually be able to survive more so than other animals and be able to adapt to its environment a little better, so long as we manage to connect up that habitat and have good patches of the habitat that can sustain the populations of harvest mice. So this is actually an area of Brandon Marsh that we surveyed here, and that had been completely flooded less than a fortnight before we did the survey, and I do mean completely flooded. Really underwater, and when we came to do the survey we weren't really sure what we'd find. We found quite a few saturated nests that were just completely dripping and destroyed, but we did find this little fella here on the right, using the habitat right where it had been flooded, so that's less than 2 weeks. Obviously they may be able to survive if there is good habitat nearby that they can use for sanctuary and refuge. But it was surprising how quickly they then seem to come back to that very wet area, considering they don't like being wet and they don't really have waterproof fur. But it seems that they are able to rapidly recolonise an area potentially. Again, we'll take this with caution, it was just one little mouse, but he was a survivor, and potentially shows that they are quite a versatile little species and there's hope for them in the future. So to sum up really, they're potentially more widespread than we thought, which is great, and it's probably just more that we haven't really been looking for them. They are quite elusive, they can take quite intensive effort to survey, or at least someone who might recognise a nest to find one. The good news is that conservation efforts for them can be quite minimal and involve us just leaving areas alone for a little bit, something that we don't seem to be very good at the moment with our tidy gardens and whatnot. But just avoiding cutting grass, having areas of uncut grass on rotation, connecting the landscape with those hedgerows can really help. And that's about it, I think. So I can't thank anyone enough. Like, we've had so much help from so many people. I've been really overwhelmed by the positive response that we've got and the involvement. This is just a few people, but there are loads more people to thank, all of the volunteers and everyone involved. So thanks very much, and thanks for coming tonight. Let me know if you've got any questions.
We get a mention up there, Preston Environmental Group, and you came to Will Spencer's farm in
Yeah.
Preston, but there was no mark on the map indicating that.
I think there should be.
But I just wondered if that was because that wasn't done in enough intensity, or...
No, I think there should be a mark on the map.
It's not if it's Preston's where I think it is.
Get a marker out. Just put it in.
It's in there somewhere.
It's gone.
Oh, it's gone. Not entirely sure which point is which, but I'm thinking it's one of these.
Yeah, I thought we were right down
Right
at
on the
the bottom. Yeah, right down at the bottom of the map, because we're quite close to the Gloucestershire border. Anyway, it was just...
I think it's one of those two. I'll double check the coordinates though. I think it was when I did the mapping one of those two, but I shall double check for you. No worries. I do remember that was one of the very first sites. It was we got quite a few mice, didn't we? It was really nice.
Did anywhere make any changes based on what you found?
Yeah, so we've had a really positive response when we've been out surveying, and I've been in a great position to be able to actually talk to the landowners or the people who are managing the land. And people have been really receptive. I've talked to them about not necessarily changes, even just maintenance that they can continue to do, and small changes like I discussed here about maybe having a strip of land, those kind of things. And obviously working with the Warwickshire Wildlife Trust has been great. I've been able to talk to the reserves and survey teams, and that's actually directly impacted the management of those sites in some cases. So yeah, hopefully been actually able to make a difference straight away, which has been really great.
I've got a question about when you find nests. So when you're looking for a nest, you find quite a lot of them. How many do they make per individual? So do you know if it's one individual or
Yes, so the females will tend to make one nest per litter that they have, and they'll have several throughout the year. And normally the females have their own sort of little territory, so they might, if you've got some that are in close proximity, they'll generally tend to potentially be from the same female. They've got about a 350 metre home range, females. The males aren't really so territorial, although they're not particularly territorial in general, harvest mice, but the females are a little bit more. So yeah, if you find a small clump, it's likely to be from the same female potentially. But you can find, I mean, there's lots of people say, you know, if you find one, you're not going to find one for another 5 metres, so just continue walking and then search. In my experience, that's not true at all. If you found one, you've often got one almost right next to it, which is probably the female making the spare nest in case she needs to run into that one if she's disturbed. And you can get them in quite close succession. It will depend on the vegetation that they're in, you know, the habitat. And also the vegetation will kind of dictate how high they make their nests and whereabouts they are in that vegetation as well. So it really varies when you're out there, but I would say if you find one, don't just continue walking for a little bit to look for another one, search right there as well.
How big are things like barriers, like sort of like roads or tracks or whatever, in terms of the connectivity? For example, at Coombe, when we looked, they were on the neutral grassland, but they weren't in the reed bed. Would they be able to cross the track if there was suitable habitat either side?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. It's one that nobody has an answer to yet. So the PTES actually have suggested that as one of the main pieces of research that needs to be done on, as you say, barriers. It doesn't just have to be a road, but any kind of barrier. And roads are obviously becoming more and more of a problem, fragmenting the landscape, but also in particular now things like motorways, we're getting more safety barriers, those kind of things that are completely blocking access to animals on either side. So harvest mice generally don't tend to travel that far. Obviously it depends on the mouse and the time of year, but a lot of studies sort of find that they haven't travelled more than 10-15 metres when they go back to re-trap if they've trapped before, which isn't really that far, and that's potentially in their habitat, which is all nice and hidden. So for them to travel over quite an exposed road is probably quite an ask. So, like you said, at Coombe we didn't find them on the other side, so it's entirely possible that they're not able, or they are resistant to travelling across exposed roads where they could just be eaten by an owl right there and then. But yeah, it's a good question, and one that we don't yet have a full answer to. Hopefully we will soon. Any budding researchers out here can answer that question.
The success story at Selborne, you said the farmers came together and produced a connected landscape. Any idea how quickly the harvest mice came back?
I don't actually know how long it was, but it was fairly recent. It wasn't like a 20-year programme to get it going. I think it was only a few years. It didn't take that long. Harvest mice are thought to really rapidly recolonise habitats. They can get there really quickly so long as the corridors are there. So although they're quite small and they don't necessarily travel that far, if the habitat's there, they will get there within a certain time frame. So yeah, I don't actually think it was that long.
So presumably you could target corridors out of these known.
You can have a look. You could do a lot of work in terms of connectivity and looking from sort of aerial maps about what you could do. A lot of work's already been done on creating and maintaining hedgerows, which is great, but it would be even better if we could make sure that they've got some tussocky, nice little grass bits by the side of them. The general rule really is that you're supposed to have at least a 2-metre margin of uncut grass for the harvest mice to kind of thrive. I have found harvest mice in areas that aren't that wide, but you know, that's the idea. 2 metres is quite a good buffer strip.
In terms of sort of habitat management, obviously if we're managing an area that's got scrub and grassland, and you've got things like brambles, how much of the bramble can you take out and still leave enough in? Because obviously if they're liking a bit of bramble, but still keep, if you like, the grassland sort of scrub interface, if you like, and stop the scrub encroaching too much into the sort of the quality bits of grassland that are probably likely to hold higher populations.
It's a good question again. They don't like loads of bramble without much grass. You can find them nesting in bramble, particularly in the winter. They will take refuge in hedgerows and brambly and scrubby areas, even holes onto the ground and stuff. In the summer, not so much. They'll be out in the stalk zone in the grasses.
So you're saying thin amounts of bramble, good. Dense bramble thickets, perhaps not quite so good.
Perhaps not quite so good. They're not really associated with sort of heavy scrub and woodland type areas. Although they have, again, they don't necessarily meet all the rules, and they have been found, you know, the odd one in woodland and whatever. But generally, it's the grass that's important. Yes, they do like a bit of bramble because it can hold stuff up and provide support, but it's the grass that you need in there. So if it's just a load of bramble and no grass, you're unlikely to get as many. But it can be quite hard to manage. The brambles taking over.
Did you look at different sort of types of grassland, like acid grassland as opposed to neutral, as opposed to?
So this study, because it was such, you know, it was just an initial stage study, we weren't able to have the large amount to be able to make the comparisons, and we didn't choose a certain amount of each habitat and directly compare it to the others. There's so much more scope and so much more that we could do. Not just, you know, just getting population data would be great as well. I think the sites that we generally looked at were kind of neutral grassland sites or general kind of improved grassland sites. But you know, so long as there's nice grass and food, you might find them in any grassy place really. Yeah.
In areas where you get dormice as well, living wild, which we don't have much in Warwickshire, but what would be the main differences between a dormouse nest and a harvest nest?
Yeah, so I have to say I'm no expert in this, having not really come across any dormouse nests in Warwickshire. But I think the general rule is that with the dormouse nests, they tend to have broad-leafed tree leaves entwined within them, which harvest mouse nests, just as a general rule, don't have. So a harvest mouse nest might have a bit of, say, meadow sweet or bramble leaf on top as kind of like a token anti-predator or camouflage mechanism, but they don't really have those broad leaf tree leaves in there. Also, I don't think there is much of a solid structure as the dormouse nest, with potentially as many layers that you see. But I'm afraid I'm no expert, but that's how I understand it. Much harder to differentiate when you've got the two species in the same county. Alright.
Just one question, is there any plans to revisit these sites in the coming years?
So not at the moment. The project was just a short project that was funded by the PTES, so at the moment we don't really have any plans to do anything particularly with those sites. And if we were, you know, it would probably be kind of a voluntary additional thing that we got together with different groups to do. But at the moment, sadly, no.
I was just going to add that, of course, that's something that the Mammal Group could take up now, and then it's a voluntary thing
Yeah.
to carry out.
I mean, I already had contact from several other people who were like, oh, we think we've got some, can we have a survey? And it just kind of took off, and it's been so nice to have such a positive response, really. And especially with something like a rodent, you never know what kind of response you're going to get. But it's been really positive, and there's loads more scope for the project. There's loads more sites to survey, resurveying as well, getting population data, understanding the different habitats better, barriers. There is so much we could do. Hopefully we'll get more people into harvest mouse research. Alright, okay, I think that's the end of the questions. If you do have any more questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. You can come up at the end, or you can also contact me. You can find me on the Wildlife Trust website. And yeah, I just hope that you've enjoyed our series of winter talks, and that you've learned something new from all of them. And yeah, please do keep an eye on the website, and we'll be sending out emails as well, and our Facebook page to keep involved with what we're going to be doing in the summer.